Welcome to a very brief history of Community of Christ. I'm very happy that we have got Lachlan Mackay back with us today and for the rest of this week. Yesterday was a fantastic, just absolutely mesmerizing class. And it was such detailed that we actually didn't get too far, I don't think, in our history. It was all fascinating. So we want to maximize our time today. So I'm just going to turn the whole works over to Locke and let's get started.
Thank you, Scott. I'm hoping today to continue or even increase the amount of interaction. So if people have questions at any point, feel free to jump in. Just a quick review of yesterday. Maybe one of the most important things I'm hoping you will remember from yesterday is some of the context surrounding our beginnings. Remember that we are, in our earliest years, communitarians, and there was quite a few others experimenting with communal living at the same time. We were utopians with this dream of a perfect society, which we call Zion. Others had similar dreams, but with different names for that. And we are Christian primitivists. And we're going to continue exploring that a little bit today. But based on the New Testament book of Acts, in particular Acts chapter 2, we are trying to physically recreate on the shores of Lake Erie what we are reading about in Acts chapter 2. So very much rooted in the New Testament. Clearly some Hebrew Bible emphasis early on as well. And as you'll discover, that grew through the years into Nauvoo. So more and more Old Testament influence in the church. Any questions as I go to screen share and we get ready to keep moving? Okay, so I think part of this will be review. I think we were partway through this slide. We were talking about some of the temple functions, which are laid out in section 85 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Among them, a house of learning. So things like the School of the Apostles, which was missionary training, the School of the Elders, which kind of moved around a little bit, but leadership or priesthood training. The Kirtland High School met on the third floor of the temple, students ranging in age from 6 years old through adults, learning how to read and write, learning how to do mathematics and geography. They knew that if their missionaries went on missions, they would need to be able to figure out how to get home. So things like geography were being studied, even more advanced subjects, Latin and Greek and Hebrew. I'm going to expand this a little bit. Even better. So this theological institution gets started, the Kirtland, Ohio Theological Institution, they called it. It was one of the first 5 seminaries operating in the state of Ohio. So I love the way that in the 1830s we embraced education. We were all about education. In the States anyway, by the early 20th century, I think some of us started to get a little suspicious of education, and it took us a while to return to that emphasis. But definitely in the early 19th century, very focused on education to improve our lives as well as our children's. We hired a man by the name of Joshua Satius to teach us Hebrew in Kirtland. He was extraordinarily talented. His family had worshiped at the Toro Synagogue, now the oldest synagogue in the US in Newport, Rhode Island. He had written several textbooks. You see photographs of 2 of them on the desktop there. That little one is, because his larger version, there was a shortage. There were not enough copies to go around. So we convinced him to put together a little tiny supplement for use by the Kirtland, Ohio Theological Institution. So our own book. Included in these books are things like lists of obscure and anomalous forms found in the Hebrew Bible. On that list is Nauvoo, carrying with it connotations of beautiful. I think it shows up in Isaiah, a reference to beautiful mountains. So a word that Joseph learned in Kirtland, and of course he later used to name a city in Illinois. Continuing with temple functions as outlined in section 85 of the Doctrine and Covenants, was to be a house of worship, a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith. And most of that happened on the first floor or in the lower court that you see photos of here. They would gather on Sunday mornings for hymns and prayers and sermons and testimonies. They'd break for several hours, they'd eat lunch, they'd come back for more hymns and prayers and sermons and testimonies. They'd break for dinner. Some might then come back for choir practice. As we talked about in the tour the other day, there are choir lofts in the four corners of the lower court of the temple. They also had Thursday prayer meetings in this space, generally presided over by Joseph Smith Sr., the father of the founder of the movement. They would come in the morning, fill up the room, drop these massive curtains or veils that would turn one big room into four small ones, assign an elder to each corner, and have four of these prayer meetings going at once. It would allow for more participation, but even with the curtains in place, some of their prayer meetings would go from 10 in the morning to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. They also started on some Thursdays having fast meetings. My speculation is that this is the roots of what would eventually grow into oblation offerings. So on Thursdays, on these fast Thursdays, you wouldn't eat, as the name suggests. You would bring the food that you would have eaten. You would give it to a steward who would distribute it to the poor. So Thursday fast meetings in this space as well. Temple was dedicated on March 27th of 1836. For that service, they squeezed 900 to 1,000 people into the space. As we talked about, children on the laps of adults, every seat and aisle were crowded. The service was 7 to 8 hours long. Sidney Rigdon preached for 2.5 hours, and his efforts that day were described as pathetic, which was actually a compliment, meaning that he could elicit pathos. He could make you cry. He could make you experience lots of emotion. There's really kind of a funny quote in the church newspaper that says that to say it was good would be halting praise. To say it was great would be not strong enough. You know, he just apparently was an amazing speaker that day. Again, 2.5 hours long. Joseph Smith read the prayer of dedication, which had been composed by a committee on the 3rd floor of the temple. So at times in our history, not so much today, but at times in the past, we would have been uncomfortable with the idea of a written prayer, concerned that it might constrain the spirit. But Joseph and this committee composed the prayer of dedication for the Kirtland Temple, which he then read from a printed copy. I mentioned earlier the Sunday services, and I think I mentioned that there was typically sacrament or communion or breaking bread or the Lord's Supper, or they even called it on the day of dedication, the Eucharist, during that celebration, that dedication service. And you see the sacrament table, that brown table that flips up and locks into place. We often don't stop to think about why it is we do the things we do. But a number of years ago in Kirtland, we started collecting journal accounts and newspaper accounts, trying to understand the various sacraments. What did it mean to them in the 1830s? What language did they use? How did they do it? Well, we served pew communion versus altar communion, meaning they didn't go up to the altar to participate in that sacrament. Instead, the bread and the wine, and it was red currant wine, of course, until a Mr. Welch, a Methodist lay minister, adapted pasteurization to grape juice in 1869. Grape juice was only an option for a week or two a year because it would quickly ferment. So we were using red currant wine and bread made by members, and as was the red currant wine. I have one account that talks about a tin pail that was passed down the row. So clearly a common cup, which would be a little uncomfortable today. It's pew communion versus altar communion, because in Community of Christ, we don't share an understanding of transubstantiation, meaning These are symbols of the body and blood versus actual body and blood. So we don't go to the altar to venerate the emblems. Instead, church leaders bring those out to the participants. And on the dedication day, while communion was being served, the service continued. So imagine the sermon going on while they were passing the bread and the wine. Let me back up. It was a glorious time, kind of months surrounding the temple dedication, both before and after. People are recording in their journals incredible spiritual experiences. They talk about pillars of fire on the roof of the temple and angelic choirs singing along with them. Now, Joseph Smith had said, if God gives you a manifestation, keep it to yourself in 1835, meaning you're not really supposed to share those kinds of experiences. But these people were so overwhelmed that they apparently couldn't help themselves. And within 10 days of the temple dedication, a non-member living in Kirtland writes to his sister and says of us, they say the temple is lit without candles. We were so excited about these experiences that we were talking not just among ourselves, but with the larger community as well. This was described as a Pentecostal season. And the members, as they heard that language, pillars of fire, mighty rushing wind, they would have immediately connected those phrases to the book of Acts. So we didn't have to say to our members at this point in time, we are carefully recreating what you read about in the book of Acts. We didn't say that. We didn't have to. They would have immediately made that connection. They would have understood what was happening, and that the church was again on the earth as they understood it. Let me pause there for questions, because we're kind of at the peak of the Kirtland story, and it starts to go downhill from here.
Locke, were there any musical instruments at all in the temple?
Were there musical instruments in the temple? I think not, because as restorationists or Christian primitivists, I think we'd flip through the pages of the New Testament and say, I don't see instrumental music used in worship. So I think not. By 1840s Nauvoo, Illinois, I think there's an attempt to get a pipe organ. So that understanding is shifting. And I think that it was probably shifting in the larger Christian community too. Not to say that there were no instrumental music used at the time, but later, for example, one of the things that caused the disciples of Christ, another restorationist tradition, to schism, this is just one of them, but was the use of instrumental music. So today, for example, in rural Ohio, you can drive around and see little tiny churches in the country, and it will say Church of Christ, and in parentheses underneath, non-instrumental. They're still pretty serious about it. Other questions?
Was there a requirement for the men who were sent out on mission or took leadership roles to attend the school in the upper level and to complete that level?
So a question about requirements to go on missions. So the requirement really seemed to be that there was great encouragement to attend, but it really was a requirement to prepare. So this major focus on preparation, both intellectually and spiritually. And so, for example, church leaders come from Missouri. They basically leave their families in Missouri and come to Ohio and are there maybe up to a year as the temple is moving towards completion, and they participate in the schools, but more important to them, or maybe just as important, was this concept of spiritual preparation that we're going to dive into. So I said that the dedication was the high point. Actually, we're not quite to the high point. It was this focus on spiritual preparation, and they wouldn't let their ministers go overseas until they had been endowed with power from on high, or clothed with power. We'll dive into that, but it's this idea of being filled with the Holy Spirit. They believe that as a result their missionaries would have an advantage over those who were not endowed with power.
Catherine here. Was there a requirement for the ministers to be also part of building the physical buildings? So would they be, part-time in school and part-time building?
No, I don't know that it was a requirement, but I think most participated in some way. So it was definitely a community project, and not just the men. Women were sewing the veils and almost certainly working on rugs, and in some cases sewing clothes for the workmen who were wearing them to shreds. So it was very much a community effort. We have accounts of children driving teams of animals loaded with stone from the quarry, which was a couple of miles south of the temple. So many people involved.
Food that was distributed to the poor, would that be given to member and non-member?
Was food given to member and non-member? Certainly there would have been non-members who received some of it, but it probably was an accident. And what I mean by that is that there are, of course, non-members in member families. And so I'm sure that they were given some of it. But we began to have a bit of an antagonistic relationship with non-members in the community because they were warning us out, meaning the political leaders of the township are publishing lists of members saying, we believe that you are impoverished and in danger of becoming wards of the township. So we're telling you to leave so that that doesn't happen. And I don't think they forced you out, but I think that relieved them of some of the burden of having to care for us. We also, Bishop Whitney, the bishop of the Ohio Church, started what they call love feasts. Again, 2 and 3 day long feasts for the poor in Kirtland. I do believe that most of it would have been members that were being cared for, but then most of the township population, at least 2/3 of it by 1836, is members.
Backing up a little bit, Locke, there's been a couple of times that I've seen the term mine apostles.
Yeah.
What are mine apostles?
I think it's just a funny form of my. It's I think it shows up in the Doctrine and Covenants, and I think it's just my apostles, but I'm not sure if it's King James English or their attempt at King James English.
Okay.
If anybody wants to pull up a King James version and see if mine, M-I-N-E, shows up, we could solve that.
Like when they were serving communion in the temple, did the priesthood have to challenge whether they were members or not?
I don't believe that I have seen references to people quizzing you on your membership. And in fact, in 1837, William Law is in Canada. He later was a member of the First Presidency. And Joseph and Sidney Rigdon are in Canada visiting and teaching. And William writes a letter to a friend and says, oh, Brother Joseph teaches that Sister so-and-so, whose husband won't let her be baptized, we can confirm her and serve her the sacrament, etc. So that quote actually makes me think we probably did care if you were a member or not. But I also think it's fascinating that we were confirming somebody without baptism in 1837, based on the teachings of Joseph. Early in 1831, before Joseph got there, we were really strict. Now, I think this was not the teachings of the church. This is members who were new to the faith who got a little carried away. But there are a couple of accounts in it might even actually be 1830 Kirtland, where the missionaries had just passed through, and we were having sacrament or communion services, and we would throw non-members out and put blankets over the windows. No, once Joseph Smith came on the scene and others from New York, they got that straightened out, that was not appropriate. Part of the challenge is they don't write down a lot of details. So as I continue to think through your question, I think I need to say, I just don't know for sure, but the serve her the sacrament, etc., makes me think we probably did care at some level. The Doctrine and Covenants says that as the sacrament is being blessed, communion is being blessed, we should kneel with the church. So of course we still do that in Community of Christ. We kneel as able for the prayers, but it's kind of fun to see in the different Latter-day Saint tradition churches who held on to what. But because of course we didn't all hold on to all of the 1830s methods of worship. So our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they don't all kneel. They don't kneel with the church. It's only the person reading the prayer that kneels. And for the longest time, they held their arm at the square as they were blessing the sacrament, blessing communion. Just like we sometimes do at baptisms, not realizing that it's probably Masonic when you stand there with your arm at a right angle, probably rooted in Freemasonry. Other questions? All right, we'll move on. I'm going to jump through the 6 verses of the Spirit of God originally. So we sing 4 today, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
But originally there were 6. One that we took out and more recently put back in, verse 6 in the 1830s, how blessed the day when the lamb and the lion shall lie down together without any ire. So I'm thrilled when we managed to put a version of that one back in more recently. So continuing on, why a temple? And this was maybe the most important reason. So we talked about their desire to have a place to educate their ministers, as well as their members, their children, a place to worship. But maybe most importantly to them, they were really focused on this idea of spiritual empowerment. So from section 85, they're building a house of glory and a house of God. That's rooted in their Christian primitivism. So from the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 8, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. That's also found in a slightly different version in Luke. Repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed to all nations. You are witnesses of these things. I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city, meaning Jerusalem, until you have been clothed with power from on high. So again, Jesus to his disciples. So this idea of being endowed with power or clothed with power, really important to us early on. Joseph Smith restates that concept as section 38 of the Doctrine and Covenants. But instead of tarry in Jerusalem, it's go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law, and there you should be endowed with power from on high, and from thence whosoever I will shall go forth among all nations. So you start to notice a pattern, this idea that we should come together to be empowered by the Holy Spirit for missionary outreach. Fairly quickly, they start trying to put this into effect. So their first attempt at spiritual empowerment was at the Isaac Morley Farm in Kirtland in 1831. It was their priesthood conference of church leaders. So this call to come together to be empowered by the Holy Spirit for missionary outreach. And then they start adding fairly quickly to this pattern an ordinance. We would call it a sacrament today. And at the Morley Farm, it is ordination to high priesthood. It is the first time that basically Melchizedek priesthood is introduced to the church in 1831, June, the Isaac Morley Farm. They also record these incredible spiritual experiences. So just kind of overwhelmed by the power of the Holy Spirit, this Pentecostal outpouring as part of this. They understood through that experience that they were endowed with power from on high. They could go out and be more successful. It worked, but they thought it should work better. So they didn't give up. They tried again with the opening of the School of the Prophets in the Whitney store. You see a photograph of here. So the opening of the School of the Prophets, once again, a call went out to church leaders to gather together, to be powered by the Holy Spirit for missionary outreach. The ordinance this time is feet washing under the direction of the presidency. It worked. They thought they could make it work better. They tried again with the opening of Kirtland Temple. So from section 92 of the Doctrine and Covenants, build a house, in the which house I designed to endow those whom I have chosen with power from on high. For this is the promise of the Father unto you. Therefore I commanded you to tarry, even as mine apostles at Jerusalem. So January to March of 1836, once again, a call goes out to church leaders to gather together, to be empowered by the Holy Spirit for missionary outreach. And the ordinances, again, we'd call them sacraments today or some variation of, evolve. So there's this really significant focus on physical preparation. So they would physically cleanse their bodies as well as wash with, this is going to be strange. What's the word of wisdom say to do with strong drink? What's the word of wisdom first?
Section 86 of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah, what is it?
It is guidance, not commandment.
Yeah, basically a health code. What to eat, what to drink, what not to eat, what not to drink, some things like that. And what does it say about strong drink?
It is not for the stomach, but for the washing of bodies.
Yeah, and that's what they did. What's strong drink? What is strong drink?
I think that's up for debate.
So I don't think there's a debate. I think we have come to misunderstand it. What do we think it might be?
Alcohol.
Alcohol. So that's what we think it is today. That is not what they thought it was. They differentiated. So strong drink is distilled spirits. So they felt very strongly that you should not drink distilled spirits. So like whiskey. And they were having problems in the community, not so much Latter-day Saints, but there was a distillery in Kirtland near where we were living, and locals were unfortunately spending way too much of their money there to the detriment of their families. And some of them were getting drunk and falling down in the snow, and their legs were freezing off. And it was just a real problem. So, and this was also, the temperance movement was raging at the time. Temperance does not mean prohibition at this point in time. It means moderation. And so that's really what the word of wisdom was saying. But when it came to strong drink, no distilled spirits, except for the washing of the body. So they would use cinnamon whiskey and perfume water as part of this ritual cleansing. And they wouldn't have known it, but of course, distilled spirits would actually sanitize. It would even kill germs. And they'd then put on clean clothes. They'd go into the temple. They'd anoint the head with oil. And then they'd offer a sealing or confirming blessing of that anointing. And they did some feet washing. And through that experience, they understood that they were endowed with power from on high, that they could then go out. And there was this wonderful Pentecostal outpouring surrounding this. So that's the Kirtland Temple endowment, or this, we might even call it in some ways spiritual formation today. They were very focused on preparation to engage with the Holy Spirit.
Locke, do we know how many people actually went through that Kirtland endowment?
I think we probably have a pretty good idea, and I think it's in the hundreds. And unfortunately, it was official members only, which at this point in time meant male priesthood.
Was fasting some of the preparation?
I think fasting was some of the preparation, particularly those Thursday fast days. And I think it'd be really interesting to do a study to see if they were fasting beyond that. But I do not know the answer.
Many people still in the church fast before communion.
Yep. And something else that we did before communion regularly in the 1830s is that as part of the service, somebody would stand and confess something. I think actually the Doctrine and Covenants tells us to do that, but that can be really dangerous. Somebody would vocally and publicly confess something that they had done, and then the participants, the congregation, would be privately and silently confessing, I think, what they had to confess. And that continued for a long time. Might even, well, no, probably not anymore, but that was an important part or a regular part of communion, which in the 1830s, by the time the Kirtland Temple was dedicated, we were trying to figure out how often is often. Most Protestant denominations at this time might serve communion 3 or maybe 4 times a year. Of course, Catholicism weekly. We were trying to figure out where we fit into that, and we were pretty much coming down on weekly by the time the temple is dedicated. Other questions? I want to jump back to the word of wisdom because I felt like I left that kind of unfinished. So we covered strong drink. What does the word of wisdom say about wine?
I think it says wine of your own making.
Yeah, and that you're supposed to use it for your sacrament offerings. So the only time they thought you should drink wine was for communion. Now I said that's not quite right. The only time that they thought you should drink wine was for your sacrament offerings. But by Nauvoo, they understood sacraments to include the sacrament of marriage. So it would be not uncommon in Nauvoo for there to be a wedding feast with cakes and wine as part of that. But there was not, for the most part, when people would come to Nauvoo, they would fairly regularly comment on the lack of public drunkenness for a city our size. So I don't believe, clearly some people were drinking too much, but it really was a pretty temperate society. Temperate. What else? What's it say about beer? Mild barley drinks are good for the body, is what it says. Remember, at this point in time, water was not. Lots of illness. They sometimes would put their outhouses too close to their wells. Lots of problems with water. Mild barley drinks are good for the body. I think beer was really quite low alcohol content at this point in time, typically. Lots of grains. Word of wisdom really encourages lots of grains, encourages meat sparingly in the summer. Why might that be a good idea in the 1830s?
Because they didn't have refrigeration.
Yeah, no good way other than salt to preserve meat. So more likely to have problems with spoiled meat in the summer. I am tonight participating in a celebration for the 100th anniversary of Park of the Pines in Michigan, one of our campgrounds. And I just ran across a 1920s reunion where the whole 10 days they served no meat because of the word of wisdom. That's coming back into fashion these days.
One more question. I guess we can debate for hours about whether wine was fermented or not. I did a little research myself, and out of 20 scientists or whatever it is, 14 or 50 of them agreed that it was unfermented grape juice.
So how would you keep it from fermenting?
You'd use it up first.
Say that again?
You'd have to drink it first.
Well, yeah, but you can only do that at harvest.
I don't know.
So I don't think there's a debate. I think it's pretty clear that it was fermented, other than, a week or two of the year when harvest is on. You can experiment at home, buy some natural grape juice and leave it on the table for a week and see what happens. Or don't, yeah. They did get creative in the 19th century because they recognized that alcohol could be a problem. And so in some traditions, they were doing things like soaking raisins to try and create basically grape water, raisin water that they would use for communion, things like that. But until 1869 and Mr. Welch, they really didn't have a good mechanism to prevent grape juice from fermenting. What else?
When you talk about the Kirtland experience, was there any sense of pilgrimage of people coming from other places to come to the temple for those experiences?
Once they had gone through this empowering experience, began to send missionaries overseas. So the very first overseas mission, Joseph Smith, sitting in the elders table where that brown sacrament table is, leans over to Heber C. Kimball, who you see in the photo, and tells him he's going to send him on the first overseas mission for the church. And a few days later, Heber C. Kimball is set apart in the Sidney Rigdon home across the street from the temple, and he and other missionaries are soon heading to the United Kingdom. And they have amazing success. They landed at a time when there was an economic recession taking place. I think there was difficulties in the Church of England, the Anglican Church at the time. And for lots of reasons, the missionaries' message was amazingly well received. And soon, thousands of converts are made in the United Kingdom. And relatively soon, some of them would start packing up and heading across the seas. By that time, they're really in Nauvoo that they're heading to, though. What's going on in Kirtland, though? So we probably grew to maybe 2,000 members by 1838 in the township alone, with maybe only 1,000 non-members in the township. But we also had opened a bank. So
now, Locke, when you say members, again, is that women, children, or just men?
So that's all. So if I say official members, that's men. But if I say members, that's men, women, and children. So we owned we owned a fair amount of land in Kirtland, and it was rising in value quickly. It wasn't just us that was moving into this western reserve of Ohio, or New Connecticut, it was called sometimes. It was a great place to be because the Erie Canal had opened earlier, connecting Lake Erie to New York City, and the Ohio and Erie Canal had opened through Cleveland, connecting down to the Ohio River and the markets of New Orleans. So this part of Ohio was an amazing place to be at the time. Lots of people moving in, land values increasing, and on top of that was the economic pressure that we generated by gathering. So lots of us moving in at the same time. So our land holdings were getting increasingly valuable, but you can't spend land. So we came up with this idea of opening a bank to convert some of that non-liquid asset into a more liquid form. What we didn't really understand, though, is that the Ohio State Legislature was becoming very fiscally conservative. They had granted lots of charters for new banks in the preceding years, meaning they had approved lots of new banks. They had decided there was enough. And so when we applied to the state to open a bank, they said no. But we had a problem. We had already on credit purchased printing plates to print our banknotes. So printing your own banknotes was not a big deal at the time. That was quite common. But we'd already purchased notes that said the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. But without a charter from the state, we couldn't be a bank. So we got creative and we rewrote our articles of incorporation, and the Kirtland Safety Society Bank becomes the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. And we actually stamped on some of the notes the word anti on one side of bank and an INGCO on the other. So is this legal? Well, we had attorneys, non-member attorneys, saying, yes, that's legal. There are 1816 banking statutes in Ohio, rewritten in 1824. And our attorneys were saying, yeah, that means that it's legal. Well, eventually a judge rules that the bank was not legal. And it's a bit of a problem. So we opened the bank early in 1837, but within a few weeks of opening, local newspapers ran articles that said that anybody who accepted one of our banknotes could be subject to a $1,000 fine for illegal banking. Now, a farmer and their family might make $12 to $40 a month at the time. So a $1,000 fine is a big threat. So nobody wanted to take our banknotes. And if they did take them, they would sprint to the bank to redeem them, to turn them in for gold or silver. Well, that means there's a run on the bank. So within just a few weeks of opening, we suspend payment on the notes. We say, that's a good $3 bill, but hold on to it. We'll redeem it for gold or silver later, but not now. The whole banking industry was in turmoil in the US at this time, though. And by May of 1837, the banking panic of 1837 sweeps through the country. And all the banks in the country suspend payment on their notes. So suddenly it looks like we are in the same shape as everybody else. But remember, we're in trouble before the panic hits. Later, almost all the banks reopen. We are not able to do so. We fail. Again, our attorneys are saying it's legal. Turns out, I think it's not. Joseph and Sydney are charged with illegal banking. It's a civil offense, not criminal. They are convicted. They post, I think it's $1,000 bond, but they leave before they appeal. Pretty complicated stuff. But because of the bank failure, many of our members start packing up and heading to Missouri. We are squabbling with each other. Most members didn't lose that much money in the bank failure, but the fact that they lost any money was enough because people had come to believe that this was God's bank. And how in the world could you lose money in God's bank? So we're squabbling with each other. Probably 15% of the membership is lost at this time, but more importantly, 30% of the leadership of the church is lost at this time. Now, a fair number of those would later come back, but very difficult times. Many of these people start packing up and heading to Missouri. More than 500 left in one day with something called Kirtland Camp, or the Poor Camp. Most of the members had already left. Those too impoverished to go are left behind. And the 70 of the church take it upon themselves to organize the Poor Camp, where they kind of get everybody together and communally care for each other as they walk the something like 600 miles to northern Missouri. So what happens with the temple?
Locke,
Yeah.
how overextended was the bank?
I don't think we know for sure how overextended the bank was. And it gets worse because Joseph eventually is saying, it's going down, stay away. But other church members are fully engaged and continuing to circulate the notes into the summer and fall of 37. So I don't think we really know how overextended it was. There are interesting, if you ever read Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History about Joseph, she lays out his debts, which are often the church debts, and it's pretty significant. But she also doesn't include any assets. So we are financially significantly overextended, but it's not as bad as it appears in Brody's work, because there's no consideration of assets. Other questions?
And are any of those notes still around?
Those notes are still around. They're very collectible, very, very collectible, sell for thousands of dollars. And then a kind of a funny side note, apparently somebody had prophesied that the notes, and maybe Joseph, would be as good as gold someday. And so when the Mormons get to Utah, they eventually issue some of these banknotes on gold, with gold as backing, to fulfill that prophecy. Joseph III, in about 1866, is in the Willoughby, Ohio train station next to Kirtland. And by chance, he's there when somebody has one of these notes and is making fun of Joseph Smith Jr., talking about what a scoundrel and a charlatan he was, having no idea that this is his son who's walking by. Joseph III listened for a minute and he said, well, wait a minute, that's a $5 note? Well, yeah. Well, I'll give you $5 for it. Oh no, it's worth much more than that. So what became of Kirtland? Initially, we leased the temple to the Western Reserve Teachers Seminary and Kirtland Institute. I think we touched on this the other day. It's a 5-year lease. It's a teacher's training school and then a model school on the 3rd floor. So local children are guinea pigs for the teachers to be. They move out after a year saying it's too many steps and too hard to heat. By 1840 or so, we were converting those people in the UK, and the initial route that a lot of those immigrants took was to sail to New York, take the Erie Canal, and then steam down Lake Erie, which means they were passing right by Kirtland. And a number of them would stop to visit, and they would see these beautiful homes, many empty, and they would see this beautiful temple, basically empty. And there were still some church members in Kirtland, and they realized that they could convince those English converts to stop short. And so the church in Kirtland starts growing again in the 1840s, back up to maybe 400 or 500 members by 1842 and 43. But that's causing big trouble with Nauvoo, the city in Illinois by then established, because Nauvoo is built on land purchased on credit. And if our members are stopping in Kirtland, they are not buying in Nauvoo. And the only way we had to pay for the land in Nauvoo was to resell it to the gathering converts. So we start squabbling with each other, and eventually the members in Kirtland are convinced to move to Nauvoo. So by 1844, they're back down to about 100 members here. Joseph Smith Jr. is killed. Then there's simply a series of smaller Latter-day Saint tradition groups of different varieties coming and going. You see a photograph. This is one of my favorite objects in our collection. This is James Strang's scepter, the king of Beaver Island, the largest island in Lake Michigan. James was crowned king of Beaver Island. So you see his royal scepter there. Lots of small groups coming and going through the years. By 1855, William Smith and Martin Harris are having conferences in the temple. By 59 to 64, Zadok Brooks is there. Eventually, a lot of those folks shift their allegiance to the reorganization. And by 1874, we do have a congregation or branch meeting in the temple. And in a move that I love, they named their branch, their congregation, the Siona branch or Tiona branch, which is Zion in Tahitian. They were celebrating the international success of the church in Tahiti at the time, where we had just baptized hundreds and hundreds of members. And you see here the first church corporate seal from the 1870s, the Lion, the Lamb, and the Child, with a palm tree in the background, celebrating the growth of the church in French Polynesia at the time. That Siona branch is unfortunately squabbling with each other. They basically are extinguished, but the current Kirtland congregation dates to 1886. So that's who's using the temple, possession of the temple. A different question is who owned the temple. I think we touched on this the other day too, the various chains of title, the different owners. There is 4 of them. You see the first of 4 here. You'll notice that there's a bit of a problem. There are people selling the temple before there's any record that they own it. That's the first chain of title. The second strand you see here, you'll notice that it ends with Joseph Smith in behalf of the church. Here's the third one. This is the one that the LDS church, after Joseph's death, the 12, convinced William Marks to sign the temple over to them or their trustee. But William Marks, you'll see here, had already signed it to Joseph, back to Joseph in 1837. So he had nothing to convey, but they asked him to do it anyway. We then sell it to a non-member friend of the church in 1846. He's an attorney here in Hancock County, Illinois, George Edmonds Jr., for $10,000, who then sells it back to the church for $1. So these aren't real sales. They're attempts to strengthen claims to the property. So you can tell that we're starting to squabble with each other about church property after Joseph's death. And here's the 4th strand or 4th chain of title. This one is revived by a guy who didn't like us, a non-member in Ohio, who convinced friends in the Illinois state legislature to pass a law, pass legislation, specifically so that Joseph Smith's properties could be sold to recoup the costs of prosecuting him for the bank failure. So Joseph is long dead when this is happening. The guy who buys the temple, it's sold on the courthouse steps for $150. There's some land in there too, is the grandson-in-law of this guy who doesn't like the church. And on the same day, he sells to William Perkins, who sells to Russell Huntley, and who sells to Joseph III and Mark Forskett. So by 1873, Joseph III is in possession of the deed. He was going to sell it to the city of Kirtland for a town hall. They said, wait a minute, we don't think you own it. We think it's really church property. Joseph III eventually is convinced, but he also realizes this is an opportunity to make a point about identity. So tragically, the property was not nearly important to us at this time as proving to the world that we were Joseph Smith's church, not those people in Utah. That was the driving factor for us at this point in time. So we create a lawsuit, the Kirtland Temple suit. The plaintiff is the reorganized church. The defendants, Joseph Smith III, it's friendly, he's our president. John Taylor, who was the president of the Mormon Church in Utah. But this is in the middle of the cohabitation hunts or the polygamy hunts, meaning federal officials were trying to arrest Mormon leaders like John Taylor for cohabitation. So had he turned up, he would have been arrested. So he didn't turn up. The judge ruled in 1880, Judge Sherman, this is a great language, the reorganized church is the true and lawful successor to Joseph Smith Jr.'s church and entitled to the property thereof. Doesn't get much better if you're focused on identity at this time. But then Judge Sherman said, oh, but you filed the case wrong. Case dismissed. It's like it never happened. So we had used a particular legal maneuver that in order to use that, we needed to be in possession of the temple. And here's the confusing part. We were, but for some reason in this legal proceeding, we said we were not. And so as a result, the judge tossed the case dismissed. But we seemed to ignore that last sentence where he said case dismissed. And we only focused on that great sentence about the true and lawful successor. And so we raised generations of our members to believe that we own Kirtland Temple because of this lawsuit. That's simply not true. We own Kirtland Temple because of adverse possession. meaning of all of the people that had claims, and we had a claim, we were the first to possess, maintain, proclaim to the world it's ours for 21 years in Ohio. And after 21 years, our cloudy ownership ripened into clear title as early as 1881 or as late as 1901. We were pretty excited about that, though, and so for generations, we put on the front of the temple this statement about reorganized church and succession by order of the court, which kind of pains me. We basically were using the temple, sacred space, as a weapon to bash our Mormon cousins with for a long time. I'm guessing some of you remember this sign or some variation, because it didn't come down until 1986. The congregation that's there now, again, 1880s to the 1950s, they met in the temple. We had Kirtland district reunions at the temple on the grounds for many, many years. 1950s, they moved to Temple Grove in Ohio. Major restoration work on the temple in the 1950s. And even today, we regularly host historical and spiritual pilgrimages there. New visitor center, I say new, but 2007 opened. We have anywhere from 25 to 40,000 visitors a year, generally coming from all 50 US states and 6 continents. We also welcome community worship and weekend retreats. Whew. Wow, that's a lot of information in a hurry. So I know it's 1 o'clock, and if you need to go, that's fine. But if you have a few questions, I'm happy to stick around.
Let me begin by thanking you so much once again, Locke, for all this information. It's fantastic. One thing that I was puzzled about, you've mentioned a couple of times that in a certain era, official members only included ordained priesthood. And I've never heard that ever before. And I'm wondering if you can kind of, and maybe I missed the beginning when you may have touched on that before, but I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that.
So yeah, it's a term that shows up in the 1830s occasionally, for example, in Joseph Smith's journal, when it talks about who is there at particular services. It's official members. And I don't remember how I figured out that official members meant priesthood only. But I bet the Kirtland Council Minute Book might shed some light on that. Let me see if I can find something for tomorrow on that.
That would be great. I was also wondering about the first missionary. You mentioned he was set apart a few days after Joseph told him that he would be going on a mission. What was the setting apart simply in the capacity as a missionary, or was that also like an ordination?
So I think it's simply, so he's already ordained a member of the Council of 12 at that point in time. So I think it's kind of like when we do setting aparts of mission center officers or sometimes congregational leaders, basically a prayer of blessing for success in this new role. Other questions?
When they went to England first and had such success, what was the driving power behind that? Was it the restoration idea, or was it the message of Joseph and the Grove experience and the Book of Mormon and all kinds of things?
Definitely wasn't the Grove experience, because they weren't talking about it.
Okay.
I think maybe to some extent the restoration message, this gets a little uncomfortable, but I think to some extent it was our message of, let me back up. So there is in the Millennial Star, which is a church newspaper published in the UK, this wonderful account of the ship, what's the name of that? Rats. I had it and I just lost it. But it's a boat filled with English converts. There's this amazing description of them. And it talks about how they are the industrial poor. They are enslaved by poverty. So they're the factory workers that are starving to death and desperate. And this article talks about how God has set aside on the banks of the Mississippi this place of safety and salvation for them. So basically, a land of milk and honey, where they can come and their children will be safe and fed. I'm using some of that language that's not in the article, but that's what it's saying. It talks about how these people are enslaved and worse than Egyptian bondage, but God is allowing them to be saved and to make it to Zion, banks of the Mississippi. I think they called it the Mormon colony or something. So this is kind of uncomfortable, but I think at least part of it is economic salvation. They were desperate, and we offered them hope. So if you've not yet read the Mormon History Association's Best Article Award for, I can't remember the particular category, it might be a graduate student, was on the first Community of Christ member in, I think it's Nigeria. Is it Gobert Edet? And it talks about how he connected with the church in the 1960s, and how part of that was a way out for not just him, but his family and his community. And when I say a way out, I don't mean leaving Africa. I mean, we helped with food, and we eventually brought him to Graceland and educated him and helped care for his family while he was gone. So not surprisingly, part of the attraction of the message is it's going to be better for myself and my family in the future. Is that uncomfortable?
No, that's okay.
It's that way in much of the world today. People join Christian denominations. Often the same family might be engaged in 3 or 4 churches because the churches help.
I was watching a webinar or something. It was through genealogy stuff that was talking about the Mormon history, and that after Joseph was murdered, they said that there were like the Mormon or the LDS there would charter a whole ship and bring thousands and thousands of people, primarily heading to Utah then, because Brigham Young had been a great preacher in the UK, and they were kind of following him because they liked him.
Yeah, that was called the Perpetual Immigration Fund. And so what I described is an early version of that, but Joseph is still alive when they start that. So I'm not sure if we were yet chartering whole ships, but the missionaries would basically bargain collectively and pay for passage for big groups of people. I forgot to tell you that on the boat I was describing, it's driving me nuts, I can't remember the name of the boat, where these people are so deeply impoverished. Among those sailing is Miles Romney. Any guesses on who his descendant is? It worked. So this idea of economic salvation for myself and my family.
Just to comment on stuff that went by, when you saw that lawsuit between John Taylor, we need to remember that John Taylor is the one who was the first pastor of the Toronto congregation.
Oh, yes, sure enough.
Who ultimately became the president of the church there.
Yeah. So I'm sitting next to, well, just a few doors down from the William Marks home in Nauvoo. And after John Taylor was shot in Carthage, he survived. They brought him back to Nauvoo, and he's recuperating in the William Marks home. And at least one visitor who visits him says that the musket ball that they had pried out of him is sitting on the mantle of the fireplace.
Wasn't that ship that you're talking about, the Britannia?
It's not. It's like this.
Well, there's Britannia, North American, Isaac Newton, and the Sheffield.
It's the Sheffield. Thank you.
Okay.
I knew it was. Yeah, the Sheffield. Did you pull it up? The description? Can you read the description for us?
Well, it basically just says registry in the tons
Okay.
for it.
I'll try and remember to bring that article tomorrow, because it is an amazing description of how deeply, deeply impoverished these people are. and how great it's going to be for them in Nauvoo when they get here.
Yeah. Well, Brother Phelan had a lot of relatives over there that he wanted to convert too.
Yep.
Which helped start the group going.
Yep.
The other thing of interest is that not only were people migrating from Kirtland to Nauvoo as it began to grow, there were people came from Canada, from Ontario. Chris Barrows, just after they got to Brockville, she happened to be talking to a woman who brought her an article from a historical magazine about a group of families, a bunch of wagons that I think it was like 1838, 39, are leaving from their little village, which they had called Nauvoo, here just south of Ottawa. And we're actually going to Nauvoo, Illinois. And so there is a couple of other examples of that same migration that was going on as it went from Kirtland as well.
Love it. Yeah, they also were doing, even earlier, they were headed to northern Missouri, and tragically, I think some of the people camped at Haun's Mill were a wagon train full of Canadians, which we'll talk about tomorrow.
I don't know if you're going to be talking about it in this class, but Australia had some good ships that sailed across the ocean to California. The Julia Ann is the only historical wreck of a church ship.
Huh.
And the Penfield family from El Monte were the first converts in Southern California, were on that Julia Child Ann. And I wrote a paper on that a couple of years ago.
Nice.
A really fascinating crew that came from Australia.
Very nice. So tomorrow we're going to get into Missouri, and it starts not too bad, but some of the most painful part of our early story is in northern Missouri, and the militarism that's there, and not some of our finest moments. So tomorrow is always the lesson that's a little hard for me.
Yeah. Well, yesterday you left off with that question about the growth of jobs and job descriptions at the 1835. Wasn't that a lot because of the whole democratization of the United States at that period, and everybody wanted to be priesthood of all believers in the church?
So I can't remember what I was talking about, so I don't know that I can respond to your question.
The expansion of the elders to the 3 in the presidency, and the 12, and all the 70s from Zion's camp. I think everybody needed to have a title because we're going against the whole idea of the priesthood of those educated at Harvard.
Makes sense. I think that sounds like Nathan Hatch's argument, maybe.
One other question. Our great-great-grandmother is listed in the 1861 census as LDS.
That's us, probably.
That's us.
Probably.
In 1861. I figure that's my question, whether our cousins from Utah were organized and in Ontario very strong back in that time. I had just assumed it was RLDS.
Yeah, I don't know if they were or not, but in many places we're LDS into the 1920s and 30s and 40s. So until the Mormons come back, there's no reason for us to not be the LDS. So you can go online and find LDS plates from congregations and LDS band uniforms, and on and on and on and on and on. But it's all us until, especially in the Midwest, until probably the 50s and 60s in some areas.
Yeah, after Mountain Meadows, LDS pretty much tried to get only in Utah and Nevada area, Arizona, until about the 1870s when they started doing the missionary work again.
Yeah. Of course, our legal name, as you know, there's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Strangite. There's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Brighamites. There's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Reorganites or Josephites. It wasn't until the early 70s when we got sick of saying, no, we're not that Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Polygamy was such an incredibly controversial issue, of course. We kept saying, no, that's not us. We're the anti-polygamy group that we started TAC and Reorganized on to try and solve that.
Are you going to be talking at all in your series about this polygamy question and what really happened in Nauvoo?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I just did a Project Zion podcast on the topic. So you're welcome to listen to that podcast, but I'll also touch on it in the class. And I'm happy to try and answer as many questions as I can as well.
Thank you very much, Locke, and we really look forward to tomorrow's session.
Looking forward to it myself. Thank you.
Yeah,
Woohoo.
see you later. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Locke. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.